So thank you everybody for joining us today. As Bryony said, today's talk is Lunatics, Cripples and Incurables, looking at disability in archive collections. And my name is Gemma Fowkes. I'm a Community Heritage Officer here at Gloucestershire Archives. So in this talk today, we're going to be looking at examples of disability in historic records kept at Gloucestershire Archives. We're going to be considering historic terms and definitions of disability, and we're going to be looking at the history of disability as seen through written and visual records. Before we start, just a bit of a warning that today's talk will cover themes in historic language which would be considered very upsetting and offensive today. The talk will also describe outdated beliefs, attitudes and also practices, and there will be discussion of mental and physical health, illness, death, suicide, abuse, childbirth, miscarriage, plus many other sensitive areas, so just be aware of that. And to the right we've got a really lovely picture of J. Smith and Evans, two injured World War I soldiers recovering at a military hospital during World War I here in Gloucestershire. So I thought we'd best sort of start off by giving a definition of disability today. And I think the one that gives the best clarity is from the 2021 census, and we will look at censuses later on. So it's good to have a sort of modern day, current definition of disability to start us off with. So in the 2021 census, it asked, do you have any physical or mental health conditions or illnesses lasting or expected to last 12 months or more? If you answered yes to this, it would class you as being disabled. And if you answered yes, you would be further questioned, do any of your conditions or illnesses reduce your ability to carry out day-to-day activities? And in the 2021 census for England, 17.7%, so 9.8 million people were classed as disabled. In the Southwest specifically, approximately 7% said they were limited a lot, and approximately 11% said they were limited a little. So disability can be congenital. This doesn't necessarily mean genetic, which means that it is present from birth, or it can be acquired, so through infection, cell mutation, by accident, medical malpractice, crime, war and so forth. 78% of disabled people today acquired their impairments or chronic illness aged 16 or older. Age and disability are often connected, and approximately 2% of people become disabled every single year. So we're now going to start talking about the records. So the collections at Gloucestershire Archives, if you go to our online catalogue, which is where all of our records are listed, and type in disability, it will bring up 85 hits more or less. When you think that we've got millions of records listed on there, this is quite a small amount. So why so few? Well, most of the records flagged with disability come from the last 40 years or so. The move towards better provision and access have been well documented: council minutes and school records, hospital documents and in charity collections. Specific terms are more successful when searching, though modern terms like neurodivergent and ADHD, you will only see them appearing in the most recent years. If you want to look up disabilities, it's easier to locate documents using the language of the time. And here we have some historic terms for disabilities. So this isn't by any means a comprehensive list, but certainly gives you an idea of what we're going to be looking at today. So some of these would be blind, crippled, deaf / deaf and dumb, defective, epilepsy or falling sickness, feeble-minded, fool, freak, idiot, imbecile, impotent, incurable, insane, lame, lunatic, mad, madhouse, mad doctor, mental deficiency, mental handicap, moron, natural or natural fool, and senile decay. And in the right hand side you can see a detail from the 1939 register. This is a type of government census that was done at the beginning of World War II, and you can see my great aunt Patricia McCormack, and if you look to the right where I've circled, you can see that she's described as a blind imbecile. Now, when I showed this to a family member, they were understandably extremely upset when they saw the language of the time. But as we're going to be seeing today, most of the terms, at least in the 1800s, that we would consider very offensive today were once medical terms. However, that isn't always the case. And I've just cut out a sentence from one of the male patient casebooks from 1916. This is from Horton Road First County Asylum. Asylums we're going to talk about a lot. In this context, we're talking about mental asylums rather than we hear a lot about political asylums today. But in the case notes written by the doctor, what he has said about this patient has improved considerably during week. Converses and answers questions naturally, but is a crank. And you can see that he's put crank in inverted commas. The word crank would not have been a medical term, and as we're looking for disabilities and collections, we do have to sort of try and work out, it's not always clear, where something would have been used as a medical term, or where someone is using perhaps just inappropriate language. Which sort of makes us think about language today. The word disability itself is problematic. Many disability groups consider their way of life to be a positive and alternative way of living. They think the word disability is very negative. They don't consider their disability to be an impairment. The neurodivergent and deaf community particularly stand out when talking about this, but they're certainly not alone. Having said that, I did look into alternatives, and there isn't really one that is appropriate for this talk that is good enough as an umbrella term, so I will nonetheless be using it throughout. So the ease of finding records. In terms of what you might find using the terms we just talked about, records relating to disability can be divided roughly into two groups. Those before 1800, which tend to be quite random, very hard to find, they don't give much description. Once we go after 1800, we tend to find a lot more records relating to this area, and that is largely because the government sort of gets stuck in, start building hospitals, mental asylums. They bring lots of legislation, such as making primary education compulsory, and once you get that, you of course get a lot more paperwork, and so we tend to find better records going from that time. Above you can see a photograph of a child with smallpox. Now this was taken in Gloucester in 1896, and it's quite a rare survival of this type of thing, and we're reminded that photography was not invented until the 1800s. Even once it becomes more common, well into the 1900s, you're going to find very few photographs depicting disability. There are some exceptions, and we'll have a look at those. So we'll get stuck in. So we're going to start off with this particular record. Occasionally a person's disability is referenced in parish records. So these are the ones that would have listed things like burials, marriages, births. In this register of burials for the parish of Lower Swell, the burial of Richard Watcraft in 1868 is listed, and if you look there, you can just see, I'm just going to make that a little bit bigger, you can see underneath his name they've actually added a note. I've blown that up slightly bigger at the bottom, and it's been added, deaf and dumb, killed by a runaway horse. We don't know whether this was added because it was unusual or because it was interesting. It is sort of interesting that if we look again underneath Richard's name, can you see Isaac underneath that? And the note that's been added there is a description of his death. He actually fell onto a pitchfork, and the person who's filled this out has added a frightful death, which does make me wonder whether it was because the person writing these records was looking for more unusual things that they could note down. It might also be that being deaf and dumb was believed to have an impact on Richard's death, perhaps because he couldn't hear the runaway horse. So teaching the deaf and dumb language, very interesting, and starts perhaps a little bit earlier than we might have thought. These letters written by James L. Dighton in 1796, they were written to his sister for the benefit of her youngest daughter, and this was because his niece Arabella was deaf and dumb. And James writes pages and pages and pages of notes about teaching the deaf and dumb language at the time, slightly different, I believe, to how it's done today. James gives very practical and detailed accounts of this. For example, putting the child's finger again in your mouth, pronounce strongly the letter with great force towards the palate. It produces a kind of smile very visible to the eye. Now, the word deaf originates from the Old English word deaf, meaning lacking the sense of hearing. And today, hearing loss is a general term for any difficulty hearing or recognising sounds, whereas deafness typically refers to a severe hearing loss where there is very little or no functional hearing. And today, many of the deaf or deaf with a smaller d community prefer deafness to be seen as a human difference rather than under the umbrella of disability. And as part of that, sign language is also viewed as a minority language. So difficulties in inserting independence. Within a miscellaneous collection of records, we have this hastily written note from 1879. In the note to a bank clerk, Annie Marie Roberts, who is described as deaf and dumb, is explaining that she would like to withdraw money from her bank account without her mother's knowledge. It'd be very easy to infer from what she has written, including I'm very much vexed about it and she has difficulties trying to withdraw that money, that her mother has previously perhaps taken more money than agreed from her bank account. It's possible also that the bank clerk is denying access because of her disability. It might be something else entirely. It might be that she didn't have the right book that she needed to get to the money. It might be because of her age. We might be just reading far too much into it. It might, however, demonstrate the practical difficulties of a person in the past with a disability attempting to assert independence. And I've also included this item because we rarely find documents written by a person where a disability is identified. So moving on to this letter from Charles Hayward of Quedgeley to his cousin, Hayward discusses a local artist. Did you know any of the name of Arrowsmith of Newent? A poor boy calls me sometimes who's been improving himself in London as an artist in the portrait line. He is both deaf and dumb, yet wonderfully intelligent. I find many of Newent families patronise him, and I have a notion he came from that quarter in his infancy, now a pupil of the Royal Academy. So what I did was I did a bit of an online search on this, God bless the internet. And I was able to find Thomas Arrowsmith. So Thomas Arrowsmith was born deaf and educated at home by his older brother John. And interestingly, his brother John actually published The Art of Educating the Infant Deaf and Dumb, a book which advocated the integration of deaf children into conventional schools at the time. Now, we know that Thomas attended the Royal Academy in 1788 to 9. The letter from Charles Hayward that we saw previously was written about this time. And I was actually able to find, interestingly, this portrait on the right-hand side, which is one of the portraits he did. It was recently sold, and you can see that underneath the painting is dated to 1825, which suggests that being deaf did not prevent Thomas from leading a successful career as an artist. So on to one of the earliest uses of blind in our archives, Isabel Rice versus Joan Bodnam defamation case, which happened on the 11th of July 1603. To summarise, there's lots of name calling, resulting in Isabel Rice being accused of having an illegitimate child, a bastard. The defendant, Isabel, is described as earning her living by attending her uncle John Gill, a poor blind man who lives by the arms of the parish. And you can see I've just highlighted that section underneath. So one of the most dangerous diseases of the past was smallpox. And here in the records for Dursley, we see an epidemic of smallpox which took place between 1735 and 1737. And if you can see the full page on the left, or if not, the detail that I pulled up underneath, you will see that there is smallpox mentioned all the way down this. Smallpox, almost every other line. These are the records for the local overseers of the poor, and these were basically the bigwigs of a particular town who managed what was known as the poor relief, the money normally coming from them as well. And what they did was they gave out money to the poor and needy, and for any parish jobs which needed doing. I know as I was looking through this, I saw things like killing a pig or pig killer, and that type of thing, different jobs. But here, money is given out on a weekly basis, including to families suffering from smallpox. Today, many diseases such as cancer and AIDS are classed as a disability. So often diseases, fell very much into that realm. But if I could just draw you to the bits on the page, which I've underlined in yellow, you can see it says Frank Stevens in the smallpox, which means probably that he was so poorly, and you can see he's getting money every week, that he was impoverished and his family was suffering, and so that is why they gave out the money. And then if we go on to the next page, many who contracted smallpox died. In these same records, we do find quite a lot of examples of money for things like coffins, relating to burial services as well, just showing how many people died from this. Those who survived were often left with scarring, and you can see that unfortunately in the photograph of the child on the left hand side. If you know stories about Elizabeth I, for example, you'll know that she wore very heavy makeup, and that was to cover the fact that she'd survived smallpox when she was younger, and as a result she had a lot of scarring on her face. But less well known is the fact that lots of people became blind as a result of smallpox. And if we follow Frank Stevens through the records over just a few weeks, we can see he goes from having smallpox to becoming completely blind. And you can see one of those at the bottom. It says Frank Stevens almost blind, and then there is another one further down that just says blind. This would have been devastating for Frank and his family, as it would have left them with a permanent impoverishment. Frank was given 2 shillings per week, which was equivalent to 1 day of labour by a skilled tradesman at the time. So yes, something to help, but not necessarily a huge amount of money. And many people during this specific epidemic were left blind in the town of Dursley. Physical disabilities are also listed in the collections. So parishes attempted to avoid being held responsible for the poor from other areas. This page comes from the Bisley Parish Register, and it is part of a removal order recording that the parish sent those it believed to belong elsewhere back to either their place of birth if it was known, or if not, their last place of residence. So this section reads, Henry Lynette, a poor, lame, poor, aged man, was by us returned to Stroud 16th of May 1908. And Henry Lynette was given a passport, that would have been a bit of paper, which allowed him to pass through other places on his way back to Stroud. Without this, he may well have been whipped as a vagrant. Another example of lame, some disabilities were recognised as a disability more frequently than others in the past. Being blind, deaf and dumb were often recorded, as were physical disabilities, often described as being lame, crippled or crooked. And here in the town of Dursley, money is paid to Jane Fords towards the upkeep of a lame child by order of the courts. It's quite probable here that this was a local person who had taken into a child, and the money was being given to help with that. Lame is an early English term meaning restricted use of one or more limbs. Its meaning came from to break, suggesting injury rather than being congenital, although I suspect it was an umbrella term. It applied to restricted use of arms as well as legs. So here in the Cheltenham Free Press, a case is reported, Bowles versus Neal. Mr. Neal was accused of unfairly dismissing Bowles. That unfortunate man, George Bowles, a cripple with one arm, the father of 7 children, this is what the lawyer is saying, who had been appointed the clerk of this parish, was suddenly dismissed from the office. And Bowles is accused of drunkenness, leading to his dismissal. George Bell's disability here seems to have been used by the lawyer primarily to incur sympathy, as I'm sure the fact that it's noted that he's a father with 7 children has also been added in as well. Very hard to read this case. I've tried to read it in several newspapers, and it's a bit befuddling, but Bell seems to have won the case. So now a more modern use of this. The word cripple originally referred to someone who crept, limped, was physically impaired. It's a very old word. It dates back as early as 950 AD. Later, it was used to describe a person with a physical disability, often being unable to walk. Cripple continued to be used as a medical term until the second half of the 20th century. By the 1970s, the word had come to be regarded as offensive. However, crippled as an adjective is still being used here. This is the Gloucester Citizen in 1991, and it's used to describe James Guthrie's fight with the council over appropriate disability accommodation. Now, Guthrie was an ex-bomb disposal expert who was injured whilst on active duty. Again, possibly here, crippled is being used to incur sympathy, or it might be just being used to sensationalise the story. But more recently, the last few years, members of the disability rights movement have reclaimed words such as cripple, crip, and gimp. And I'm just going to have a sip of drink. Thank you. So whenever you start looking into the history of physical disabilities, of course, you're going to find aids to help with that. And there's probably no greater symbol of that than the wheelchair. So here we have a very early photograph of a wheelchair. It's likely that they've existed for thousands of years, but the first self-propelled wheelchair was invented in 1655. Interestingly, quite a long time before the bicycle was invented. And here we see Colonel Cracroft of Hackthorne and Harrington in around 1865. Now, he was a military officer from a prominent family, and his photograph was taken by Reverend Blackwell, who was an early prolific photographer. The wheelchair that we can see that he's using here was known as a Bath wheelchair and named so, unsurprisingly, because it was invented in Bath. And what I think is brilliant about this wheelchair is that they could actually remove the front wheel, put in two there, and it could be pulled by a horse or a donkey. And moving a little bit further in time to World War One, you can see here a picture of one of Gloucestershire's World War One military hospitals, and you can see a slightly different version of the Bath wheelchair being used by injured soldiers. It's hard to really tell in this photograph, but this particular make of the Bath wheelchair was a really interesting one. It looked very much like an elongated sort of wicker garden chair, but still very much of the same model as the one we saw previously. Which takes us sort of handily on to disability in the First World War. Disabilities have often carried a stigma throughout history. However, with 1.5 million soldiers returning from World War One wounded, we quickly find that attitudes start to change. And here we can see the personal papers of Arthur Warlock, including his disability award, that's that bit on the right hand side, and also we can see his pension papers. Now, Arthur was wounded whilst on active service, resulting in arthritis of the left elbow, and also sciatica. And as a result from this, he was retired from the military in 1920. And I just wanted to talk very slightly about World War One hospitals because it is one of the very few areas where we do find some really nice photographs. We do find a lot more information about people with disabilities, probably because of the sheer volume of people who were wounded at this time. So as World War One progressed, there was a need for more hospitals to care for wounded soldiers. Voluntary aid, VA hospitals were set up across the UK. An amazing 24 of them were created in Gloucestershire. Many were based in large residential houses loaned by their owners, whilst others used public buildings, and even Cheltenham Racecourse was used. The Gloucestershire VAs treated 38,000 people during the war. Incredibly, only 372 of these died. And in the two photographs at the top, you can see Norton Hospital, and the photograph at the bottom, you can see Abbotswood Hospital. And my favourite, I think, is this one at the top here, showing the empty bedroom with the trench coats at the bottom of the beds, which I think is extremely evocative. So putting a price on disability, well, Unsurprisingly, disability payments have been assessed according to severity throughout time. Generally, this has been done on a case-by-case basis, but in this government document on the right-hand side, details are set out to explain what size pension a soldier would receive according to their injury. The disabilities deemed most severe resulted in 100% pension for life. And what I've done is I've just blown up that bit there so you can see it a bit better. So some examples of these are loss of 2 or more limbs, loss of an arm and an eye, loss of a leg and an eye, loss of both hands or of all fingers and thumbs, loss of both feet, loss of a hand and a foot, total loss of sight, total paralysis, lunacy. Very interesting. We're going to come back to that in a bit. Arthur Warlock, who we saw a couple of slides previously, he was given a medical examination following his retirement from the military, and the degree of disablement was assessed at 40%. And although his specific injuries, which were sciatica and arthritis, are not listed on that page on the right-hand side, his injuries were rated as equivalent to the loss of a thumb or 4 fingers of the right hand. Now, he was awarded £84 per annum for life. In 2017, this would have been worth about £3,500. And here we see another example. This is bugler A.G. Valent, a soldier injured in World War One. And here he is at one of the local military hospitals during World War One. We can see that he's lost an arm. If we were to also look at that list, an amputated arm would have granted him between 50 and 60% of a pension. Now, depending on class, he would have received the modern equivalent of around 13 shillings and 9 pence if he was a private, that was the lowest class, up to 25 shillings and 6 pence, so that's the top class possible, that's officer class 1 per week. That would be equivalent, as a private, it would be equivalent to about 2 days' wages. If it was the top class as an officer, it would be equivalent to about 3 days of wages. So we're going to talk just a little bit about shell shock. It's hard not to when we're talking about World War One. The term originated during World War One, and it was initially linked to the impact of heavy shelling, hence the name. It was used to describe symptoms experienced by soldiers during the war. It was thought to be caused by the stress of battle. Now, symptoms were both physical and mental, and they included, and this is by no means the whole list, a feeling of dread, fear, helplessness, panic, flight, an inability to reason, inability to sleep, walk, or talk, also tinnitus, sensory overload, headaches, amnesia, tremors. What we do know is that the causes and effects were initially misunderstood, and that long-term shell shock was considered to be the result of weakness of character. Electric shock treatment was very much used at this time to try and treat shell shock. And it's a really interesting one. I had a historian who told me 20 odd years ago that electric shock was 100% effective in all cases. But since then, I've come across a slightly different opinion of that. Some soldiers suffering from shell shock refused to fight. Many of them were put on trial for cowardice and desertion, and that resulted in 266 British soldiers being executed under these terms. These were given posthumous pardons in 2006. And today, shell shock would either be defined as combat stress reaction or post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And to the right, we can see the famous poster from World War One, but we can also see a photograph of soldiers at camp. And here we have another example of Henry James having shell shock within our collections. So from 1915, we find references to the war in case notes at Horton Road County Asylum. Not always initially because of active service. We start to get a few people coming in because of the fear of being sent to war. But this is an early reference to the term shell shock, and you can see that circled on the page on the right. It's in the case of Henry James, who was a 39-year-old. He was admitted for syphilis and war strain. Now, Henry was a member of the Royal Fleet Auxiliary Service, and the doctor has described At the outbreak of war, he went to France and was sent home at the beginning of 1915, suffering from shell shock. He was then returned to France several months later, but sent home again. And on that occasion, it resulted in him being admitted to the asylum in November 1916. And the medical certificate describes James as: he is demented, he smiles in a vacant, stupid way. He cannot look after himself. He is untidy and requires attention. There was a national scheme for employing disabled ex-servicemen. This largely came from World War One again. There was a desire to recognise the bravery of those who'd fought and to help them return to normal life. This resulted in government programmes such as Homes for Heroes. This was a promise to build homes for returning soldiers. But the other one was the National Scheme for Disabled Men, a voluntary programme for businesses which encouraged them to hire disabled veterans. It recommended that 5% of the workforce be made up of disabled ex-servicemen, and they promised that preferential treatment would be given in government contracts in return for this. However, it does seem that it was quite limited in effectiveness, both in terms of reaching the sort of 5% proportion of the workforce, but also in not hiring people who had more severe disabilities. And here we can see one of our local companies. We can see the papers from that who joined in that scheme. Here we can also see some photographs. This is much later on. So attempts to provide employment opportunities have really continued since then. At Doughty, this is one of Gloucestershire's largest employers. Training positions were created. These are some of the photographs recorded as portraying disabled employees, and they were taken between 1950 and 1970. But unfortunately, we don't know who they are, and we don't know what disability they have. We can see in a couple of the photographs, so this top left, we can see some crutches, and also in the bottom right, but other than that, really there are no clues to the type of disability. So on to human oddities. This is a term used more rarely in relation to those with disabilities. It's more often known as a freak. Freak originally meant bold, fierce, or quick, but over time the term took on negative connotations, referring to something unusual, abnormal, or even monstrous. The term was used particularly between 1850 and 1914 to describe human performers in the popular freak shows and circuses, also known as human zoos, of the period, who were exhibited because of their unusual body shapes or deformities. And we can see a picture on the right hand side. This isn't one of ours, but it shows one of these freak shows. You did tend to get them, this is in America, you did tend to get them more in North America, but certainly they were a thing here as well. And if I just move on to this example from our collections, in this private journal, there was a criminal case that's recorded from 1821 against a freak simply known as Lambert. And the account which I've just transcribed here for you, Lambert committed for 14 days to the Bridewell at Northleach. Lambert, a rogue and vagabond, quite a good phrase, convicted on the oaths of L. Hayward and Thomas Hunt. The prisoner was one of three fellows, his two companions being foreigners exhibiting two bears at Stow, one of which broke its lock and attacked one of the keepers, and was with difficulty forced away from him. On being reproved by L. Hayward, Lambert, was very insolent. Lambert was, as he said, a natural curiosity. His whole body, except his face and neck and palms of his hands, being, as he said, covered with a warty, blackish excrescence, like scales which rubbed off and were renewed annually. His arms and wrists, which were seen, were certainly covered in this manner. He had exhibited himself in foreign countries. So education and schools weren't necessarily the inclusive paradise that they were, that they are today. In the past, children with disabilities were generally educated at home or not at all. Some children would have attended local schools, but they are rarely mentioned in the day-to-day accounts. But laws changed towards the end of the 1800s, and schools were required to identify pupils with special education needs. initially those who are blind and deaf. And in the paperwork on the right hand side at the bottom, this is from the Cheltenham Union in 1897. We can see evidence of this. It's not the clearest item, but we can see a list of the children, and next to them we can see what disability they're said to have, and you can see you've got blind and deaf listed there. We then have the ages, and you can see they vary enormously from 5 up to, I think it's 14 is the oldest there. Addresses of parents and so on, and then we have where they actually went to school, if at all. And the information included current places of education. For the blind children, they often attended the Home for Blind Children in Liverpool, and this is because there were no education institutions to begin with in Gloucestershire for children with disabilities, and so many of the children actually went to schools outside the county. Not everyone was entirely happy about this. Deaf children attended the Bristol District Institution for Deaf and Dumb Children. Children had to board at the school, and every county was responsible for paying the necessary fees for each child. And in this letter, we can see the town clerk, E.J. Bridges, in 1894, complaining about having to do this. It is bad enough that the ratepayer to have to support, educate and clothe deaf and dumb children. Bridges was particularly grieved that the Deaf and Dumb Institution had raised its yearly rate by £3 simply because an Act of Parliament had been passed making local authorities responsible. The cost per year was £15 plus an additional £3 for clothing. This would have equated to around 54 days wages for a skilled worker at the time, so quite a large amount. So on to mental health. Mental illness can be harder to find in the earlier records. Records relating to supernatural experiences could be evidence of mental illness and disorders such as psychosis and epilepsy. In the series of papers, which you can see on the left, they were collected between 1698 and 1705. We can read about a variety of apparitions, miracles, prophecies, witchcraft. All of them are recorded in different hands and have been collected together. It might be that they tell us something about how mental illness was perceived at the time, or it is possible that we are again just trying to read too much into it. Sadly, records relating to suicide are often the main evidence we have of mental illness in the distant past. And in this register of baptisms, marriages and burials for the parish of St Catherine, Gloucester, just down the road from where I am, in 1733, we have this record. May the 6th was buried, young widow. And then a week later or so, May the 17th, in my absence at Ledbury, the wife of Pennell, a gardener, who hanged herself by a coroner's inquest, meaning the inquest had determined that it was suicide by hanging, was brought in lunatic and was put in the ground in the churchyard without the burial office through the gross negligence of the clerk in not procuring a minister, particularly in not applying to Mr. Elliot, who stayed at home expecting notice from him. All of which probably means that the woman was buried in the churchyard without a funeral service. It's likely that this was because suicides weren't supposed to be buried in consecrated grounds, and this might explain why the curate was not pleased when he found out about it. The reference to brought in lunatic presumably means that the coroner determined that she committed suicide whilst the balance of her mind was disturbed. And after all of this, they didn't even bother writing down her name. Suicides and jail registers. Legally, suicide was classed as self-murdered and was illegal, incredibly until as late as 1961. It means that unsuccessful suicide attempts resulted in arrest. This could lead to prison or incarceration in a mental asylum. Certainly, I've come across a few examples of that. In this jail register, and I do apologise, it's not the best photograph, James Bird is recorded as having been arrested for attempts to commit suicide. It's dated to the 15th of September 1892. What we know about James was that he was a labourer, he was Church of England, and we also know that he had a limited education listed as imperfect, meaning probably he could write his name and not much else. No sentences listed. And under discharge, it is noted remanded only. Without further research, this is a bit vague. Possibly he may have been held in custody until another hearing. Many such individuals were certainly held in asylums until their court date. Unfortunately, the arrest and incarceration sometimes only put off the inevitable. Here we see the patient notes for Sarah Perry, a 31-year-old who was admitted to Horton Road First County Asylum for mental anxiety. She was considered a danger to herself when she was admitted in February 1890. But she was felt to be sufficiently recovered to be discharged a year later. The newspaper article, which has been stuck in on the opposite page, records that several months later, unfortunately, she drank sheep rot, which I don't know much about this, but I'm assuming is some kind of poison, and committed suicide. And finally, we have this death certificate, another place where you can very occasionally come across examples of disability. This is John Adie, who is my great uncle, I think, and it's from the 19th of January 1861, and you can see under cause of death it says cutthroat temporary insanity. So early Christian belief held that suicide was a mortal sin, and prior to 1823, suicides were traditionally buried on highways and crossroads rather than in churchyards. Sometimes, really sadly, a stake was also put through the body. The Burial of Suicides Act in 1823 removed the ban of burial in consecrated grounds. It also banned the act of putting stakes through the bodies. Victims of suicide were now allowed to be buried in consecrated ground, but it was only allowed to happen at night time and without a Christian service. A burial service could be permitted. I'm assuming that that just meant that a vicar wouldn't be present. So on to legal mentions of disability. Mental competency often does show up in legal records, and in this set of papers from 1663 to 1722, we can see the descent of John Sturmey's estate bypasses his idiot son John in favour of his eldest daughter Mary, which said John Sturmey, the son, by all the said parishes to those present is disclosed, and agreed as an idiot or lunatic, and so void of understanding as that he is utterly unable to govern himself and his estate. And you can see I've just highlighted idiot and lunatic below. Idiot is one of the oldest words for disability. It's been in continual use since the 14th century, but certainly predates that. In earlier English, it was used to describe those who would be seen as broadly equivalent to what we would define as having a learning disability today. The word lunatic originally referred to epilepsy and madness. It came from the word lunar for moon, because it was thought that the moon was initially causing epilepsy and madness. Later, it became a broad term for a person of unsound mind or someone who was mentally ill. And it also became used as a legal term, as we can see here, for people considered to be insane. Censuses are also a really useful place if you are looking especially for family members who might be potentially disabled. So from 1841, the government had a census. They're collecting information about every household, every individual. It was every 10 years, and it provided information about UK individuals, an absolute treasure trove for those of you doing family history. From 1851, from the 1851 census, the form also included a column whether blind or deaf and dumb, and then this was extended later on to 1 blind, 2 deaf and dumb, 3 imbecile or idiot, 4 lunatic in later censuses. And by 1911, the column had been renamed infirmity. So we can see that language is constantly moving. In this 1911 census for Westbury-on-Severn, William Whittington, aged 23, is labelled an imbecile. Imbecile began life in English in the 16th century as an adjective and meant weak or feeble. By the 19th century, imbecile was being used as a medical term. So I thought this might be just a good moment to try and classify what some of these words actually meant during the 1800s and early 1900s. So most historic terms for disability are, of course, considered today extremely offensive. But before that, they were often used as medical terms. And systems were introduced in the 1800s where medical practitioners tried to classify types of learning difficulties by severity. And that's what you can see in front of you in this table. So if you were classed as an idiot, that would have been the lowest rank of intelligence and functional ability considered at the time. And to give you an equivalent of what they thought that meant, it would have been under the age of a 2 or sometimes 3-year-old. Imbecile was used to denote the medium rank of intelligence and functional ability, and there you're looking at about 7 years of age. The IQ was thought to be between 26 and 50. And then you have the word moron used, which was used to denote the highest rank of intelligence and functional ability. And that was thought to be up to a child of about 12 years of age. Moving on to epilepsy. Here we have Edith Mary, aged 5, from 1890. So those with epilepsy made up a sizable proportion of patients in lunatic asylums. And here we can see the case notes for certainly the youngest patient that I found so far within asylum case notes. And this is Edith, age 5. At the time, there was no separate provision for children. That's why she's sort of lumped in with the adults. Edith was admitted to Horton Road County Asylum on the 14th of January 1890 by her father. Edith had suffered from epilepsy since birth, and physically she's described as a well-developed, healthy-looking child, fair hair, eyes blue, grey, and bruise on the right thigh. And when I was picking out information from here to share, the reason I've mentioned the bruise is it might explain why it was that the father admitted her to the asylum. It may be that she had had an epileptic fit and she'd hurt herself. It could be something more sinister, of course, but I thought it was important to include it. A psychological condition is described at most times very lively and excited, running aimlessly about with apparently very little memory, talking continuously, at other times very depressed and not to be roused. And the notes go on to mention that several epileptic fits were recorded, but without any injury to herself. No mention is made of sedatives or restraints being mentioned, but I can tell you there is very little mention of that. We'll talk about those in a bit, but there are very little mentions of those. Medication, surgeries and special diets that are used today to help manage epilepsy did not exist until at least the next century. So there was very little effective treatment. On the 19th of April, Edith went out on trial, and this would have been a relatively short stay for a patient at that time, maybe because she was so young. So I thought we'd talk about county lunatic asylums just for the moment. As we talk about mental health a bit more in other areas, this plays a much greater part. So asylums providing for those with mental illnesses became a requirement for each county from 1808. And our records for the 2 county asylums in Gloucestershire are very extensive. They go back 200 years, and we have all kinds of different plans, photographs, submission books, rule books. But the case books, what I personally find the most useful, because they detail each patient's background, diagnosis, and observation notes. And this gives us the most complete picture of an individual with a disability in our records. Treatment was fairly limited until the mid-20th century, as I was saying, but don't expect if you look at them to see much in this area, except items such as physical restraints, occasional. Padded rooms certainly come up. Sedatives are used very occasionally. Industry seems to have been one of the key things, so sewing, work in the garden, and so on. Um, just bear in mind, if you are looking or want to look at these case books, personal records are closed for 100 years unless they involve yourself. And we can see in the pictures, the two pictures at the top, we can see the first county asylum, Horton Road, that was opened in 1838. And we can see Coney Hill County Asylum, that was the second one to be opened. It was opened 50 years later. And both of them today, in case you're wondering, closed fairly recently, and are now luxury flats. Most of it's been knocked down, but the bits you can see there. It's easy to assume that asylums were always places of misery and hardship, but once when I was giving a talk on this, one of the attendees brought in this, which was her mother's. Her mother had written this from 1988, explaining what a benefit it was being at Coney Hill Second County Asylum. Just a few pictures to just give you an idea. The top left shows you a picture of Coney Hill, and you can just see that it is an absolutely gigantic place. And then on the right hand side, you can see pictures from Horton Road, which are really lovely. The little cat down there, and you can see two patients sat here. I suspect that all this sewing has been done by patients there. And down here, this is sort of 1890-ish. We can sort of see when I spotted this bit at the back with two patients on a perfectly placed on a seesaw. I did wonder if this picture was staged. It probably was. So I wanted to give you a bit more of a deep dive into the sort of language that was used. So what I did was I went through 20, 30 a patient case notes from 1902 to 1904. This was a female casebook. And what I've actually done, you can see an example of what the books look like there and what the case notes look like. And what I've done, if I go on to the next page, what I did, I was trying to think what would make it easier to sort of put across some of this language. And so I created this sort of word art from that. And I'll just give you a minute while I have a spot of water just to have a little look at that. We won't dwell on that one any long, but I just wanted to show you an equivalent, which was this one, slightly later, 1915 to 1918. But these are from a male casebook, just to show you examples. If you're wondering why some words are bigger than others, mostly it's because they were words that were mentioned continuously. They were constantly asking about what the bowels were like and that sort of thing. What the tongue looked like. They obviously had a list of things that they had to look for. A few of these, small scar on penis, I picked out just because I thought it was quite interesting. But most of them I've done relative to how often they were mentioned. Interestingly, I don't actually think there's a massive difference between the female case notes and the male case notes that I've looked at. They're very much subjective to the time and the doctor who wrote them. The one big difference I would say is that in the male casebooks, we hear a lot about them committing acts of violence towards themselves, towards other patients, coming in because they committed violence elsewhere. With the female notes, we find them talking a lot about it, but not necessarily actually acting on it. Okay, so moving on. So voices of those with disabilities. They're often missing, unsurprisingly, from our records. We saw one earlier with Annie, but this is the only other one I could find. So they are, these letters that we see here are a rare survival of a patient's voice. They're letters that were written by a man called James Richard Amphlett Matthews, and he was a patient at Barnwood Mental Asylum, which was a really big private mental asylum in Gloucestershire. And he wrote them between 1902 and 1903. Which was the period he was there for. He was a 45-year-old manufacturer who had no previous mental health issues. He had been a quiet, even-tempered man. Until 5 days before he was admitted. He was sacked by his employers due to a sudden change in personality, and he was admitted on the 18th of October 1902 on an urgency order. His symptoms included rapid and incoherent speech, maniacal laughter, threatening violence against previous employees and also and his wife, paranoia and delusions, lack of attention. His physical health was described as being very good, except from having a hernia, and the cause given was overwork. The only treatment I came across that he was given was sedatives. And if we move on to the next page, just a bit of a close up. So the letters written from James to his doctor, Dr. Sutar, and Dr. Sutar has actually included these in his case papers, and he's commented on the following. The letters which have been inserted show very well the confused and rambling state of the patient's mind. In one letter, there is what the patient describes as his idea of a sketch of part of an airship, in case I put that in case you were wondering what his drawing was. And I was really excited when I saw that these letters were in existence, and I'm not sure quite what I expected, but it wasn't this. I transcribed a couple of these. I'm not going to read all of these out, but 1303 wants to be free, 1103 hope she'll agree, RSVP, hooray, who we are, hip hip, you are, and then he signed his doctor's name. Still, in spite of all that's been written, said and done, Doctor, understand, I'll not force your hand. I have too much sense. I hope to act sense and nonsense no more. And so it goes on. So unfortunately, you know, they do demonstrate perhaps some of the confusion he was feeling, but perhaps they don't tell us that much about his actual, practical experience of being disabled or actually what it was like to be in an asylum, but still absolutely essential for us. Um, Drunk is a frequent cause given as a reason for admittance in mental asylums in the past, both for male and female patients. The effects of alcohol can cause a variety of behaviours, as we all know. In addition, alcohol withdrawal can cause delirium tremens, which can lead to confusion, hallucinations, and shaking. Now, all of these symptoms might well result in being admitted to a mental asylum, and you can see on the top right hand side, you can see the cause given there is drink, something I've seen a lot in the notes. However, it's equally, if not more likely, that patients were admitted simply because they were seen to drink beyond normal amounts. And by the 1800s, excessive drinking was often viewed as a mental illness in its own right, as well as a moral failing, which is interesting because it is in complete contradiction with its use as an essential part of the asylum diet. They didn't stop serving beer, I think, until into the early 1900s. Women's issues, quite an interesting one. So the cause of being admitted to an asylum varied. We get some really obvious causes like money troubles, bereavement, illness. We get some less obvious ones. The loss of poultry was the most unusual I came across. Masturbation, solitary mode of life comes up fairly regularly. But we see a lot of female specific reasons given in their patient notes that we don't see in the male case notes. This includes the absence of menstruation, hysteria, worry about having a child, miscarriage, childbirth, menopause, and then domestic troubles, love affairs. We do kind of get those too in the male notes as well, but not as frequently, and they're not worded in quite the same way. Often the format of female patient notes are also geared towards this, not always, but an example of this we can see opposite for 1881. This is Alice Matthews, age 19. She's given the mental disorder of mania and puerperal, referring to the 6 weeks after childbirth. So I'm thinking it might have been postnatal depression, but I don't really know. As well as the usual information requested, there are also categories which focus on female reproduction. So the number of children they have and their ages, menstruation, puerperal again, giving birth for the first time, also immoral, which I'm just, if I can just sort of, hold on, try and, there we go. You can see immoral written just there, and you can see that someone has put yes next to it. I've only seen a few examples of those, but they all seem to be where the woman has had a child outside wedlock, as Alice here has. Hysteria is one of the ones that comes up a lot. And here we have the case notes for Dora, who was a 16-year-old domestic servant from Cheltenham. She was admitted to the asylum in 1890 by her mother, and the cause is given as hysteria. And then, in a different hand, presumably at a later date, somebody's also added puberty. Throughout history, hysteria was mostly considered a female disorder. According to research, there are times when it was applied to a male patient, but I haven't found any examples of that. Refusal to marry, infertility, menopause, miscarriages, lack of sexual desire, too much desire, sexual abuse, wandering uterus, have at all times been related to hysteria. And some supernatural causes, such as the idea of original sin and also witchcraft, were also thought to cause hysteria. In the 19th century, hysteria was considered diagnosable physical illness in women. And Dora's medical certificate reads as a strange, restless expression, slight incoherence, refusal to answer questions, many delusions, melancholia. Really, today we would say that was a synonym for depression. She is described as rather fat but well developed, rosy cheeked girl, rash of scabies all over her body. Scabies is an itchy rash caused by mites. You can see one of those right there. Unusually, her treatment is documented. We don't get a lot of that. Though unfortunately only for the scabies part of how she was suffering. She has been treated with spirit potash soap, and hot baths, then wrapped in a towel and kept in bed. As with other patient notes, very little is explained about the reasons for her diagnosis and subsequent treatment. Not leaving out the men, adolescence is a mental disorder. In this entry from the asylum, we see George Chapman, who's become a patient age 19, and the cause of his mental illness is given as adolescence, and he's described as patient, depressed and moody, vacant expression, complains of great depression without cause, is afraid of going out of doors for fear of meeting people, worries because he has no work but will not try to get work. There might be slightly more to this story. He joined the army on August the 8th, 1916, apparently a conscript who broke down at once. Worry at being called up may have been a contributory cause, but adolescence is probably the chief cause. And very little is said by way of specific treatments. I am aware, incidentally, that I've gone over slightly. There's only a couple of slides left. Just to mention syphilis, general paralysis of the insane, some mental illnesses, as well as other disabilities, were connected with moral failings and weakness of character. And general paralysis of the insane is caused by late-stage syphilis. Happens when syphilis is not treated and the mental capacity of the individual is impaired. It was originally considered to be a type of madness due to a dissolute character. This is probably due to its association with sexual intercourse and prostitutes. Symptoms included mental deterioration, personality changes, loss of social inhibitions, asocial behaviour, impairment of judgment, concentration, short-term memory, euphoria, mania, depression or apathy. Also delusions, speech disorder, tremors and disorientation, and it was inevitably fatal, and it accounted for as much as 25%, the primary diagnosis for residents in public psychiatric hospitals. And here we can see both an example of somebody who was brought in for syphilis, and we can also see their death certificate, seeing that they died of that. And finally, we do need to mention senile decay, because this is something that also came up an awful lot. Senile dementia and senility were once terms for dementia in the elderly. It originates from the word demons, meaning out of one's mind, and it's been used in medicine for a long time, 2,000 years, and was traditionally associated with getting older. Dementia was comparatively rare before the 20th century because so few people lived past the age of 80. And until the end of the 19th century, dementia simply referred to anyone who'd lost the ability to reason, and it could be applied equally to psychosis, organic diseases like syphilis, dementia associated with old age, which was attributed to hardening of the arteries. And today, it's very much a broad term for a group of conditions that cause decline in memory. Alzheimer's disease was only identified in 1907. Today, it accounts for 60 to 70% of cases in dementia. That brings us right to the end. So I'd like to thank you very much for joining me. I'm sorry I have gone slightly over. If this has whetted your appetite, I'm going to be giving a second talk on disability. That's going to be on site on the 1st of November. You do need to book in, so just go to our website and sign up there. If you felt that today it was a bit too quick going over, this and this and this, and you want a bit more of a dive into looking at, people's fuller lives, that's very much what we'll be doing in that talk. So at this point, I'd like to thank everybody very much and to go back to Bryony and see if there are any questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Gemma. I really enjoyed that. That was absolutely fascinating. So there's no other questions in the chat at the moment. So if you do have any other follow-up questions, do get in touch with us via email and we'll get back to you. But as we've run out of time now. So thank you again for coming, and thank you so much to Gemma for presenting to us today.
Thank you very much.